این شاید شروع مناسب فیلمی جدی درباره آپارتاید و تبعیض نباشه، اما من باید هر طور هست سوار این اسب بشم، چون میخوام ایرج عابدیان، یکی از برجسته ترین اقتصاددانهای آفریقای جنوبی رو همراهی کنم.
Okay.
So I hold this sort of lightly, right?
Very light. Look. Okay, just relax. If you don't relax, the horse won't relax.
Sure, no, I'm relaxing-ish. How would it go?
Just nick, give it a nick.
Yeah.
You'll follow me most probably.
من آرش عزیزی هستم، روزنامه‌نگار ایرانی در تبعیض. ما در نزدیکی کافی بی هستیم، روستایی در 1000 کیلومتری جنوب ژوهانسبورگ، پایتخت آفریقای جنوبی. ایرج در سال 1358 از ایران به آفریقای جنوبی مهاجرت کرد. اون در دانشگاه کیپ تاون درس خوند و تحقیقات خودش رو درباره توسعه اقتصادی مناطق روستایی در منطقه ترانسکای در زمان آپارتاید انجام داد. در آن زمان اقلیت سفید پوست بر اکثریت سیاه پوست و رنگین پوست آفریقای جنوبی حکمرانی می‌کرد.
So in 1980s you came here for the villages, 1981.
1981. Having come from Iran, the interesting part was to understand the society to which I had arrived, try to learn from it, to understand the culture.
So you wanted yourself to come in the middle of a place where there was no electricity in most parts. This was really rural back then.
It was
and
rural.
Apartheid made sure that it was.
Absolutely, Apartheid had neglected it. It was no industry, no electricity, no reticulations, and all of that meant they were in a way condemned to stay small, stay subsistence, and stay within the struggling economy.
من از طریق صحبت با ایرج و افراد دیگه در آفریقای جنوبی میخوام بفهمم بهای تبعیض علیه گروه‌های مختلف نه تنها در این کشور بلکه در ایران و دیگر کشورهای جهان چیه. ایرج شاید یکی از بهترین کسانی باشه که بتونه درباره این مسئله صحبت کنه. اون هم راجع به تبعیض تحقیق کرده و هم به عنوان بهایی ایرانی خودش تبعیض رو تجربه کرده. شیوه سرکوب بهایی‌ها در ایران امروز شباهت‌های بسیاری با شیوه برخورد نظام آپارتاید با اکثریت مردم آفریقای جنوبی از 1948 تا 1994 داره. قوانین و سیاست‌های خودسرانه جلوی پیشرفت شهروندان غیر اروپایی آفریقای جنوبی رو می‌گرفت و نظام آپارتاید هزارها سیاه‌پوست و رنگین پوست رو شکنجه کرد و به قتل رسوند. 11,000 کیلومتر شمال آفریقای جنوبی، جمهوری اسلامی در ایران با گروهی از مردم خودش برخورد مشابهی داشته. صدها بهایی از سال 1357 به بعد کشته شدند. گورستان‌های اونها تخریب شده و فرصت‌های آموزشی و اقتصادی از بهایی‌ها سلب شده. نظام آپارتاید هزاران شهروند با استعداد آفریقای جنوبی رو به تبعید کشوند. همین اتفاق در ایران هم افتاد و تا همین امروز هم ادامه داره.
I want to ask you something as an Iranian that I often thought about. You know, when I was a young student in Iran, one of the things needed in Iran were economists who had worked on development. And when I talk to people in South Africa and they talk about one of their best economic advisors as you, I think of, isn't the cost of discrimination here clear when a government stops a citizen like Iraj to go and serve their own country because of their religion? Isn't it all of us who get hurt?
With respect, there are many thousands of Iranians, talent and professionals in different fields who, Baha'i or non-Baha'i, are denied making a contribution to the development of their own nation. So without a doubt, you deny the talents and the resources of a nation. Not just that particular targeted group suffers, the entire nation suffers. In fact, the parallel in that area in South Africa is so strong. The whites who denied black majority development, scientific growth, access to opportunities, now, even 25 years later, the entire nation suffers the consequences. And in my humble view, it will take at least another 2 generations before the consequences of apartheid is expunged out of South Africa. So there's a heavy price to discrimination.
در اوایل دهه 60 شمسی وقتی ایرج به آفریقای جنوبی مهاجرت کرد، بهایی‌ها در ایران چنان وحشیانه سرکوب می‌شدند که این موضوع به طور مرتب در رسانه‌های آمریکا مطرح می‌شد.
The tragedy of the Baha'is persecuted in Iran in the name of Islam.
The Baha'is are a worldwide religious faith.
In general, the Baha'is practice a gentle faith that advocates meeting violence with serenity.
16 members of the Baha'is that we know about were hanged.
They were part of a group of 22 for whom President Reagan had pled for mercy.
Bob, does our government's protest make any difference?
Well, apparently not, Barbara. Another 22 Baha'is were arrested just last week.
Members of the Baha'i faith say it's a question of genocide.
And the alleged perpetrator of the genocide is the government of Iran, a case of religious genocide unique at this moment on this planet.
The fundamentalist Muslim government in Iran has displayed an intense hatred of the Baha'is that stems in part from how the tenets of the faith differ from Islam, sometimes radically. Among other things, the Baha'is believe in equality of the sexes, eventual world government, universal education, and in practicing their religion without clergy, all concepts that have infuriated Iran's leaders.
بعد از اینکه به ژوهانسبورگ برگشتم، با بعضی بهایی‌های آفریقای جنوبی به مهمانی شامی رفتم. از حدود 7 میلیون بهایی در سراسر دنیا، 250,000 نفر اونها در آفریقای جنوبی زندگی می‌کنند. چنین مهمانی در زمان آپارتاید غیرقانونی می بود، چون سفیدپوستان و سیاه‌پوستان در اون با همدیگه معاشرت می‌کنند. مهمان‌های این ضیافت اگه در ایران هم بودن، احتمالاً از زندان سر در می‌آوردن، چون اغلبشون بهایی هستند و دور هم جمع شدن.
In South Africa, it was a very unique situation in apartheid because the minority was discriminating the majority. Majority is the one that suffered. But in Iran, anybody who's belonging to minority groups is discriminated. To an extent, again, the suffering and the outcomes are the same. Discrimination is discrimination, injustice is injustice.
خیلی از ایرانی‌های حاضر در این مهمانی شام هم مثل دوستان اهل آفریقای جنوبیشون طعم تبعیض رو چشیدن. نیکا وفایی پزشک جراح، خانواده اون در سالهای اول انقلاب که نیکا هنوز به دنیا نیامده بود، به آفریقای جنوبی آمدن.
So my grandfather, his name was Rahmatullah Bafai. He had a shop in Mardasht in Iran where he would sell goods. He was part of the Baha'i community in Mardasht, and he was living with his wife, my grandmother, and their son at the time.
رحمت الله وفایی جزو صدها بهایی بود که بعد از انقلاب دستگیر شدند. تنها جرم اونها اعتقاد به مذهبشون بود. زندانیان بهایی شکنجه‌های جسمی و روحی می‌شدند تا مذهب خودشون رو انکار کنن و به زور مسلمان بشن. زندانی‌های بهایی رو وادار می‌کردند درباره شکنجه با عزیزانشون حرف نزنن، وگرنه از ملاقات با خانواده محروم می‌شدن.
It was a very emotional time. It was very difficult, more because they would keep my grandmother in the dark about most of the information, where they were keeping him, how they were treating him. Of course, they knew, as Baha'is, how the Baha'is were treated in prison. So it was very difficult for them. And of course, when she would go visit my grandfather, he would put on a brave face and try, console her. As much as he was suffering, he would not show that suffering to her.
رحمت الله وفایی در 21 اسفند 1361 اعدام شد. از 1357 تا 1366 بیش از 200 بهایی در ایران به قتل رسیدند. در بسیاری از موارد قاتلین روی جسد کشته شدگان شعارهای ضد بهایی می‌نوشتند.
Do you consider Baha'is to be heretics?
I think they are sacrilege. They are heretics. What do you mean by heretics?
Heretics in the sense of...
It is not a religion. I told you, I consider it as a political, treacherous political movement.
مقام‌های ایران منکر بدرفتاری با بهایی‌ها هستند. اما این گفتگو با سفیر سابق ایران در سازمان ملل به روشنی رویکرد حکومت در مورد بهایی‌ها رو نشون میده.
Generally, among the leaders, we had a good number of them who were agents of America or Israel.
And they were executed?
Oh, yes. It had nothing to do with their Baha'ism. It just happened that we had among Muslims also people who have been executed.
من متولد 1366 هستم، یعنی 9 سال بعد از انقلاب. کودکی من هم مثل خیلی از هم‌نسل‌هام پر بود از داستان‌های شکنجه و اعدام دوستان و بستگانم. یادم میاد هر بار از کنار زندان اوین میگذشتم آرزو میکردم روزی بیاد که این زندان به موضوعی تبدیل بشه که از طریق اون بتونیم تاریخ خودمون رو درک کنیم و با هم برای ساختن آینده‌ای بهتر برای ایران همکاری کنیم. این اتفاق در آفریقای جنوبی افتاده و موضوعی آپارتاید در ژوهانسبورگ تلاش میکنه بازدید کنندگان اون آپارتاید رو شخصاً تجربه کنن. دکتر سلیم نخچبانی دانش آموخته حقوق در دانشگاه کمبریج. او در چند کشور برای دیوان بین‌المللی کیفری کار کرده. او هم ایرانی و هم بهایی.
The lessons that can be drawn comparing Iran to South Africa, very different cultures, very different people, very different social contexts, but the desire of the system to entrench itself and to exercise a kind of domination over the will of people is the same across the board. And the methods used to do it we see right here in the Apartheid Museum. The use of identity cards, cataloging, classifying and sub-classifying, effectively allowing the individual to choose how to act and how to serve their community is something that should be controlled. It should be restricted. It should be directed. Instead of allowing that to be a free expression of what it is to be a human being.
البته تبعیض در زمان آپارتاید فقط علیه سیاه‌پوست‌ها نبود. رژیم حاکم بعضی از افرادی رو که پیشینه آسیایی، آفریقایی و حتی اروپایی داشتن رنگین پوست می‌نامید و اونها هم شهروند درجه دوی آفریقای جنوبی بودند.
Well, I can start by saying that there were 4 colored classifications: Malay colored, other colored, Cape colored, I think 4.
لئونارد مکنزی در تمام طول زندگیش با سفیدپوست‌ها و سیاه‌پوست‌ها همکار بود، اما به خاطر رنگ پوستش می‌کوشید از مناطق سفیدپوست‌نشین دوری کنه تا از آزار و اذیت در امان بمونه.
You, in many ways, had to, as far as possible, stay away from white areas. For instance, you would be walking around town, and they come out of a pub. They could easily beat you up, and nothing would come of it. So we knew how far to go and not to go. You couldn't go to a restaurant that's for whites. You couldn't go to a park that's for whites. You couldn't, in some instances, you couldn't even go to a church that's for whites, even though you're of the same denomination.
What is it that makes the systems to create a certain group of people and discriminate against them? Why is that idea so useful for them?
Well, when you think about it, it's a very simple, but it's proven to be a frighteningly effective strategy, right? What you do is you want to stay in control. So you think you need an enemy because you think that if there is an external threat to you, external to your own community, you will be able to maintain your dominance of that community.
یوجین هامس در یک خانواده مسیحی آفریکانر بزرگ شد. اونم مثل بسیاری اهالی سفیدپوست آفریقای جنوبی دوست نداشت فقط به خاطر رنگ پوست خودش از امتیازاتی خاص برخوردار بشه.
I think I understood as a young man already that various groups and various cultures have their own unique contribution to make. And that when we separate ourselves from others, we miss out. We maybe can argue, and that argument is still being made, that the system of apartheid was there to economically benefit white people. But socially, artistically, and on so many other levels, I think we were being impoverished.
زمانی میتونید مردم رو قانع کنید که تبعیض به سود اجتماع است که اونها رو فریب بدید و قانعشون کنید که از بقیه بهترن. هم حکومت ایران و هم نظام آپارتاید برای توجیه سیاست‌های تبعیض آمیز خودشون از مذهب استفاده کردند. در دبیرستان‌های ایران به ما یاد میدادن که تفسیر آیت الله خمینی از اسلام تنها راه حقه و بقیه تفاسیر آمریکایی و باطلن. میگفتن بهایی‌ها مرتدن چون بر این باورن که پیامبرشون بهاءالله جدیدترین پیامبریه که از طرف خداوند آمده. کشیش‌های کلیسای کالوینی هلندی در آفریقای جنوبی هم از انجیل برای تحقیر غیر اروپایی‌ها و توجیه تبعیض استفاده می‌کردند.
By far the largest church denomination in the Union of South Africa is the Dutch Reformed Church. With us this morning is Secretary of the Federal Council of Dutch Reformed Churches. Dominic Berger, you believe in apartheid as a way of life?
Yes, I do.
Why?
In South Africa.
Why is that, sir?
Because the race, which is in a lesser state of development, is by far in the majority here. And numerically, of course, they are much stronger. And because also I believe that it is according to God's will that the white race, which is in the majority in this country, should be preserved. And also everything we have done in the last 300 years and built up in the church and in the state should be preserved and not be swallowed up by an, I wouldn't say inferior race, because I don't believe it is an inferior race, but a lesser, a race which is in a lesser state of development.
You would find that the church would focus more on the Old Testament passages. You know, they would, for instance, say that the black people in South Africa was descendants of Ham and well, water carriers and wood choppers, you know, because that is what those descendants were cursed to be for the rest of their eternity, and that there was God's people, and well, you know, and basically the rest, which implicitly, I suppose, meant that they were the devil's people.
I considered anything and everything that had to do with Christianity as white, as white, and white as oppressive. And I thought this God that the white man is worshipping is a white man's God, and I can't see myself worshipping the same God as my enemy. I considered him an enemy, no longer just another person. To be hated by someone with no reason, if a person hates you with no reason, I mean, how else can you consider him?
این سوء استفاده از مذهب برای توجیه بی‌عدالتی بسیاری آفریقایی‌ها رو از کلیسای کالوینی راند. در ادامه سفرم به سوتو آمدم. سوتو از مراکز جنبش ضد آپارتاید بود. در اینجا به بازدید سازمانی محلی رفتم که پدربزرگ‌ها و مادربزرگ‌های محل هر روز در اون دوره هم جمع میشن.
It was not true that they're doing all this in the name of Jesus. It wasn't. Because the very same Dutch Reformed Church is very discriminatory. They didn't want black people in their church. They didn't. Even now.
These people are using the name of God and Christ, but they are doing things that they are unlike religion.
Yes, it was very bad, you know, to the extent that I didn't believe that they are really religious.
You didn't believe
no.
they were Christians?
Yes. They were just using it because they were in power then.
The founding religious members of apartheid perverted Christianity for a particular end, political control and political ideology. Exactly as it was the case with apartheid, the Iranian regime has perverted Islam, its principles, in order to shape its political ideology and enforce it on Iran. It's anything but religion, anything but godliness. It's nothing more than a perverted and distorted interpretation of Islam for self-enrichment and political power.
دولت ایران از اواسط دهه 1360 کشتار وسیع بهایی ها را متوقف کرد. اما فشارهای تازه‌ای به این اقلیت میاره که راه پیشرفت اونها در جامعه رو سد کنه. در این سند محرمانه که در 6 اسفند 1369 به امضای رهبر ایران رسید، تاکید شده که هر فردی که احراز شد بهاییه باید از تحصیل در دانشگاه محروم بشه.
There were mass detentions and executions of Baha'is from the beginning of the regime. But I think there has been a shift to other means, definitely, where economic means and social means have largely taken the place of executions. There continue to be detentions, extrajudicial detentions. But other means are used now, and denial of the right to education is a principal one. Blocking the means of economic progress is another one. For this reason, I think many around the world have started to use the expression economic apartheid.
از بعد از انقلاب اسلامی 57 بهایی‌ها اجازه نداشتند وارد دانشگاه بشن. تا به امروز اونها در دانشگاه‌های ایران نه اجازه تحصیل دارند و نه اجازه تدریس. در واقع این نوع آپارتاید آموزشی به یکی از شیوه‌های اصلی برای توقف پیشرفت بهایی‌ها در ایران تبدیل شده. به همین دلیل بهایی‌های ایران از سال 1366 دانشگاه غیررسمی خودشون رو راه انداختند. نهادی به نام دانشگاه علمی آزاد بهاییان.
When the Iranian regime banned the Baha'i youth from access to tertiary education, it was natural that the Baha'i community would have to find a substitute. They would have to find a response, a peaceful and constructive response to the inability to access national universities.
کلاس‌های دانشگاه علمی آزاد در خونه‌های مردم برگزار میشن. بعضیاشون به صورت حضوری و بعضی دیگه به صورت اینترنتی. به این دلیل نمیتونیم صورت دانشجویان رو نشونتون بدیم که ماموران امنیتی دائما دانشجویان و مدرسین این دانشگاه رو مورد آزار و اذیت قرار میدن.
Well, BIHE is a real university, is a real tertiary level school system, and it's in recognition of the fact that human beings need to be educated under all conditions, not only from a fact that it's a human rights issue, but human progress can only really mature if human beings are allowed and given environment to be educated under all conditions.
داستان محروم کردن بهایی‌های ایران از آموزش بسیار شبیه داستان ممنوعیت آموزش سیاه‌پوستان در آفریقای جنوبیه. در سال 1953 بود که رژیم آپارتاید نظام آموزشی درجه 2 ویژه سیاه‌پوستان ایجاد کرد و اسمش رو آموزش بانتو گذاشت.
The apartheid government passed a law called Bantu Education Act. The aim was that a black person must be less educated. He must just be educated enough to be able to communicate with the master. But that has affected our education because the main aim was just that we could speak a bit and count a bit.
I think the situation in Iran blocking the access of young, capable Baha'is to tertiary education is in some ways similar to what we had here in South Africa. Of course, the Africans here were streamed into Bantu education from their earliest infancy. Baha'is in primary schools may face discrimination in Iran. They're not completely barred from education. But that access to tertiary education, when you think about it, how essential it is for the full development of the potential of a person. And I mean, that's exactly what the Bantu education system tried to do in South Africa as well, to say, you are your progress should be blocked. The Baha'is are being told the same thing in Iran.
من مطمئنم که در دهه 1960 میلادی وقتی پدر رژیم آپارتاید هنریک فرفورد اعلام کرد که رژیم آپارتاید ابدیه، بسیاری از جوانان آفریقای جنوبی به فکر سقوط اون رژیم بودند.
We are here to stay. We have for a very long time developed in South Africa a nation of our own, friendly, prosperous, progressive. We hope that the rest of Africa will become likewise.
در سال 1990 که نلسون ماندلا از زندان آزاد شد، آپارتاید شروع به فروپاشی کرد. سال بعد قوانین آپارتاید لغو شدند.
At the end of the day, democracies survive, economies prosper when the nations manage to coalesce around doing the right thing under very tough circumstances.
بعد از برپایی دموکراسی در آفریقای جنوبی، ایرج به عنوان مشاور با نلسون ماندلا همکاری میکرد.
The effect of apartheid manifests itself in many different fronts. One of the costs that apartheid imposed on South Africa was that it didn't develop its human resources, so even when it's liberated, it takes two decades and more to catch up.
The resources were used to suppress as opposed to unlock people's potential and help development, educate people.
The limited resources of the country were being used for spying on people, for torturing people, for running massive prisons, for developing new techniques for torturing people. Apartheid was at the forefront of it. These were the costs that ultimately brought the structure down, ultimately bankrupted the system. At the turn of regime in 1994, and literally and technically the South African government was fiscally unviable. Now the same in many ways applies to the situation in Iran. The majority of Iranian human resources are underdeveloped these days, but they are using limited resources of the country to police people. Look at the size of the police, look at the size of the army, look at the amount of money that is spent on military forces in the region. That is a cost to the society. It's not cost to those who have been affected by prejudice or targeted for elimination. That's a cost that everybody pays.
When I see that my own brothers and sisters in Iran, and in that I mean the Baha'is and those who are not Baha'is, I mean the population of the country, are in a sense being blocked in their progress as a society, it creates in my heart a longing and a hope, for sure. And I'm sorry, this is very... But sorry.
It's difficult. We'll have better days. This might be
شباهت دیگه بین رژیم آپارتاید و حکومت جمهوری اسلامی اختلافات جناح‌های مختلف نظامی، اختلافاتی که گهگاه با خشونت همراهند و متاسفانه قربانیان اون مردم عادی هستند.
In the last decade of apartheid, one of the interesting indicators that the system was imploding was that the leaders of apartheid began to turn on each other. The party split 4 times. The cohesion was literally eroding on a daily basis. Well, if I compare what happened in the late 80s in South Africa and compare what's happening in Iran, I see exactly the same cracks appearing. So I'm not at all pessimistic about the future of Iran.
بعد از گذراندن بیش از 1 ماه در آفریقای جنوبی و دیدن اثرات طولانی مدت نظام آپارتاید بر این کشور زیبا و بی‌نظیر، بهتر متوجه شدم که تبعیض مثل سرطانه. فقط در یک عضو باقی نمیمونه، در کل بدن پخش میشه و همه اعضای بدن رو نابود میکنه. رژیم آپارتاید هیچ وقت متوجه این حقیقت نشد. امیدوارم حاکمان ایران بتونن از تاریخ درس بگیرن.
Never and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another. The time for the healing of the wounds has come. The moment to bridge the chasms that divide us has come. The time to build is upon us.